Welcome to the CDC WHO Growth Chart Training. In 2006, the World Health Organization, or WHO, published new growth standards. The Center for Disease Control, or CDC, released growth charts based on the WHO growth standards. These are the new charts we'll be using. Some of you may have heard about these charts, and some of you may not have, and that's okay too. Today we're going to share information about the new charts and how we'll implement them in the WIC nutrition program. During this training we're going to talk about the current and the new charts a lot. So for your sake and ours, we'll refer to the current charts as the CDC charts and the new CDC WHO charts as just the WHO charts. You'll learn about the new charts and how they were created. You'll discover the differences between the CDC charts we currently use and the new WHO charts. And you'll see and review the new charts as well as review the growth-related risk changes. Physical growth has always been used as a way to assess the health and wellness of infants and children. In WIC, we use growth charts to assess growth and identify potential nutrition or health concerns. We also use them as a way to share the information with caregivers and open conversations about growth, nutrition, and healthy habits. Keep these things in mind throughout the training and think about how they might be affected by the new growth charts.
Growth charts have been around for at least a century, but don't worry, we won't do a full historical review. We do want to talk briefly about the growth charts we've used in WIC so we can get a sense of how the WHO growth charts are different. From 1977 to 2000, the NCHS, or National Center for Health Statistics growth charts, were used worldwide as a growth reference. Since 2000, the CDC, or Center for Disease Control growth charts, have been used as a growth reference for children from birth to 36 months and from 2 to 20 years of age. These are the charts we are currently using in WIC. In April 2006, the World Health Organization published new international growth standards for children. We'll learn more about what went into developing those charts in a minute. Before we do, you might have noticed that the NCHS and the CDC charts are growth references and the WHO charts are growth standards. What does that mean exactly? A reference describes how certain children grew in a particular place and time. For example, the 2000 CDC charts describe how children in the United States grew during the 1970s and the 1980s. A reference is descriptive. It gives a point of comparison. A standard, on the other hand, describes how children should grow, regardless of time, place, or ethnicity. It is prescriptive. The WHO charts are based on the ideal of optimal nutrition, plus optimal environment, plus optimal care, which equal optimal growth. Reference data has its limitations. Although the CDC reference growth charts are the best tools we've had, the WHO growth standards define what is desirable growth. These new growth charts will be a much better tool for assessing children's growth. In summary, a reference compares to other children. A standard defines what is normal or desirable. What makes one chart a growth reference and another a growth standard? It has a lot to do with the making of the chart, how the data was collected, and the criteria used to decide which data to include. Let's explore how the 2000 CDC and new WHO charts were developed. The table compares the two and helps illustrate why one is a growth reference and one is a growth standard. The column on the far left describes a characteristic, for example, how the data was collected or what requirements had to be met to be included in the data for the growth chart. The second column shows the information for the CDC charts, and the last column shows the information for the WHO charts. A reference or a standard? That is the question. I already mentioned that the CDC charts are a reference and the WHO charts are a standard, so let's look at how the data was collected to see why that is. The CDC data was gathered from national health surveys like the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES, and birth certificate data. There were a limited number of measurements and they were taken less often. The WHO data was gathered very differently. The WHO charts are based on a large number of measurements taken frequently between birth and 24 months of age. The measurements were taken in countries all over the world, and they are listed here. We will see the measurements from these countries plotted together in a moment. Finally, let's look at the requirements to be included in the growth data. For CDC, there are no special requirements. But you'll notice that there are strict requirements to be included in the WHO growth data. So let's take a look at a few of them. The requirements for the WHO data really define ideal growth conditions such as exclusive or primary breastfeeding for at least 4 months and continued breastfeeding for over a year. Growing in a healthy environment which included access to health care and no smoking during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And finally, the caregivers had to follow appropriate feeding guidelines like adding solids by 6 months of age. Take a few minutes now to review the table and the additional factors listed below the table. Highlight what appeals to you as some of the main benefits of the new charts. You can share your thoughts with a partner if you'd like. Please feel free to pause the presentation for a few minutes while you do this activity.
As the World Health Organization set the requirements for the growth data, they actually had a hypothesis. They thought that children throughout the world would grow similarly if exposed to optimal circumstances. When all of the data from the 6 international locations was gathered, it supported the WHO hypothesis. This chart shows the frequent growth measurements taken from birth to 24 months of age in the 6 countries plotted all together on one chart. Does this surprise you? One of the WHO expert committee members had this to say about the new charts. For the first time, we now have a technically robust tool to measure, monitor, and evaluate the growth of all children worldwide, regardless of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or type of feeding. A group of experts from the Center for Disease Control, National Institutes of Health, and the American Academy of Pediatrics met to discuss the WHO growth standards. They all recommended using the WHO growth charts for children birth to 24 months in the United States. The United States Department of Agriculture accepted the recommendation for WIC, and here we are ready to implement the new charts. We anticipate that many health providers are using the WHO growth charts as well. We will use the WHO charts for children from birth to 24 months of age. These charts include length and weight for age, weight for length. We'll continue to use the CDC charts we're currently using for children from 2 to 5 years, which includes height for age, weight for age, and BMI for age. With this change, WIC will take height measurements for children starting at 2 years of age so they can plot on the 2 to 20-year grids. The WHO charts are meant to replace the CDC birth to 36-month charts, but we know not all 2-year-olds can be measured standing.
For those children 24 to 36 months who cannot be measured standing, use the CDC charts for 2 to 5 years. It is up to the WIC staff person to note that as an inaccurate measurement.
We'll talk about the risks more in a few minutes. You can share these charts with the caregiver and use them for nutrition education. As you might expect, the WHO growth charts show a different pattern of growth than the CDC charts because WHO measured healthy children under ideal conditions and breastfed infants and children were the standard. One of the main differences you'll notice is that the WHO charts reflect a higher rate of weight gain in the first months of life and then taper off from 6 to 23 months. You can see the difference in the curves in this chart. The solid lines show the CDC growth data and the dotted lines represent the WHO growth data. Let's talk about some of the main differences or trends you might notice when looking at growth on the new WHO charts. We'll review them here and we'll see the differences on the graphs in a few minutes. The first trend you may notice when working with the new charts is that slightly more infants and children will plot in the lower length for age percentiles on the WHO charts. Probably the most noticeable trend is that fewer infants and children will be identified with the low weight for age, especially between 6 and 23 months of age. This is because of the difference in the growth curve, especially for the rate of weight gain during this time frame. Finally, you may notice fewer infants and children with low weight for length. The WHO charts also have fewer children with high weight for length, according to the data. This bar graph shows the trend we just talked about in a visual format. As I mentioned, this graph shows a slightly higher number of kids will plot on the lower percentiles in length for age. In the middle, you will see the more significant differences of fewer kids plotting with the low weight for age. And finally, you see that fewer kids will plot with a high weight for length on the WHO charts.
Before we look at the graphs, I want to mention that because the WHO charts reflect the growth of healthy children growing up in ideal conditions, they use more extreme cutoffs of the 2nd and 98th percentiles to determine risks. These percentiles are actually the 2.3rd and the 97.7th, but we've labeled them as the 2nd and 98th percentiles for ease of use and to help with the growth chart conversation. Thank goodness. We will continue to use the 5th and 95th percentiles on the CDC charts for older children to determine their growth risks. So let's look at the actual charts and compare how the same measurements plot on each of them. This is the same child and the same measurements. We just made his last name CDC on the CDC charts, and his last name is WHO on the new WHO charts. Let's look at the CDC graph first. As you see here, the CDC birth to 36-month charts have the familiar percentiles with the 5th at the bottom, next the 10th, then the 25th, the 50th percentile bolded in the middle, and then the 75th, 90th, and 95th. Notice that Edwin plots on the 25th percentile length for age on the CDC graph. The same measurements for Edwin are plotted on the WHO chart. There are a few differences you notice right away. First, the WHO graphs show the 2 new percentiles of the 2nd and the 98th in addition to the ones we're used to. We see that Edwin plots between the 10th and 25th percentile on the WHO length for age graph. This comparison of weight for age between the two charts, you see that Edwin plots between the 10th and the 25th percentile on the CDC chart. On the WHO chart, Edwin plots a little above the 25th percentile weight for age. You might notice that infants and children plot a little bit higher on the weight for age graph, especially between 6 and 23 months of age. You see that here with Edwin. We're comparing the weight for length charts. On the left, Edwin plots just barely below the 50th percentile on the CDC weight for length chart. On the WHO chart, Edwin plots on the 50th percentile weight for length, which is very similar to where he plots on the CDC chart.
As with all growth charts, there are cutoff values to identify when an infant or child might not be growing well. The risk changes reflect the change in the cutoff values between the CDC charts and the WHO charts. As we mentioned, the WHO charts use more extreme cutoffs because the growth patterns are based on healthy children under ideal conditions. Risks for growth at or below the 2nd percentile replace risks for growth at or below the 5th percentile. And instead of risks for growth at or below the 10th percentile, the growth risk on the WHO charts is assigned when growth plots above the 2nd and at or below the 5th percentile. One other area to note is that we now have risks to identify when an infant or child under 24 months is overweight. This is new, and this risk is also identified as low risk. This risk was added at the federal level because it's widely recognized that WIC plays an important role in public health efforts to reduce the prevalence of obesity. This is intended to give the dietitian the opportunity to do an assessment of the infant's or child's eating, activity, and health. It isn't necessarily an intervention, but more that opportunity to assess and explore feeding and parent relationships. This concludes the CDC WHO growth chart training. Please take a few minutes to review the risk table now.